to the channel, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Jim Surratt, and today we're going to talk about different variations of the deadlift for the tactical population. So the things we're going to cover today are the conventional deadlift, sumo deadlift, and trap bar deadlift. Now, within conventional and sumo, there's obviously some variations. You can do axle bar if you're doing more strongman style stuff. You can do rack pulls, you can do block pulls, you can do banded chains, all these variations, right? Even within the context of trap bar, there are still variations. You can do high handle, you can do low handle, depending on what kind of bar you have. You can do bands, you can do chains, you can do block pulls, you can do rack pulls. So really anything that you can do with a straight bar, minus sumo, obviously, you can do with a trap bar. So what I want to talk about today is sort of the pros and cons, or the values behind each one of these variations. And then not necessarily which one is best for the tactical population, but just provide more of an overview of the different variations and allow you, the viewers or the operators, to make your own decision about which is best for you. So let's start with conventional, right? So conventional, straight bar, straight weight, deadlift. Okay. So personally, from a professional perspective, right? So from a personal professional perspective, I do not prescribe the conventional straight bar deadlift for my operators very often. Now, that's not to say that we won't do it. However, I have found that because of the nature of this population and the injuries that they have incurred over the course of their careers, the straight bar conventional deadlift is often not a very user-friendly movement. And so what I mean by that is that because a lot of guys have lower back, knee, hip, ankle, or foot issues, right? Being able to put themselves in the correct position, create the right amount of tension, and wedge themselves into the proper positioning, the proper posture necessary to execute a conventional deadlift safely is very challenging, right? And so also because of, again, the nature of the careers that they've chosen, these lower back injuries tend to kind of preclude comfort and stability, or the sense of security while performing a conventional deadlift, right? So if I'm going to prescribe a conventional deadlift, especially a straight bar, straight weight, conventional deadlift variation, I'm probably going to do either a block pull or a rack pull. Now you could argue, well, is a rack pull any safer than a pull from the floor? And the answer is maybe, maybe not, right? It depends. So with pulling from the floor, obviously there's no variation, and there's no variability in where the bar starts, right? The bar starts in the same height for everybody, regardless of their particular height, or their leverages, or their levers, all that kind of stuff, right? So for some people, it can be a great, no problem movement. For others, it can be very pain-inducing, very troublesome, and very unsafe feeling, right? And I found that as a strength conditioning coach for the tactical population, one of the things that you have to be concerned about is how do these guys feel about what they're doing, right? A lot of them will do, so like if I prescribe, again, conventional deadlift from the floor, my guys are going to do it. Unless somebody has like a true, very acute or, long-term chronic lower back issue that precludes them or prevents them from executing that movement appropriately, they're probably going to do it. They might not like it, but they're probably not going to say anything about it. They're probably just going to do it regardless of the pain that they might feel. However, that's not what I'm here for, right? I'm not here just to hammer down a movement and say, hey, you have to do this because I prescribed it, right? When it comes to strength and conditioning for the tactical population, we're looking for a stimulus, not for a particular movement. Tactical strength and conditioning is not powerlifting, right? I may utilize a powerlifting-based approach for my strength and conditioning programming, right? We may squat, bench, and deadlift and do variations thereof, but we don't have to do those movements. We don't have to do a conventional deadlift from the floor. We can do a rack pull from mid-shin, or from just below the knee, or even from above the knee, right? If that makes it easier for the guy to execute the movement and get the stimulus, right? Because again, we are chasing a stimulus with the movement, not chasing a movement for the sake of movement's sake. So again, you could argue, again, is a rack pull safer than a conventional deadlift? Well, again, maybe not, because there's obviously issues or variables when it comes to loading a rack pull, because it's a shorter range of motion or a reduced range of motion. You can load it heavier, right? Theoretically or typically, you can load it heavier than a standard deadlift, which can then cause more aggravation, if we're looking at something from an injury prevention or injury mitigation or aggravation mitigation perspective, loading something up heavier might create more aggravation than we're trying to avoid, right? So what it comes down to really is finding that particular range of motion, that particular starting point that is safe, effective, and comfortable for your operators, right? So we here, despite the setup that I have here, I really don't have the option to do much in the way of like block pulls, right? We don't have DC blocks, we don't have a plethora of like mats to pull off, so we do rack pulls, right? We have safety straps that I can set to basically whatever height. They're like 2 inches apart, so I can do rack pulls from pretty much any height I want. So yeah, I have found that doing a conventional rack pull is often I'll call it a safer, but a more readily accessible and maintainable variation as compared to doing a conventional deadlift from the floor. Now, there's a time and a place, right? Again, if somebody is competent at deadlifting, they don't have lower back issues, or their lower back issues are minimal to the point where they feel comfortable deadlifting from the floor with the straight bar, or if they like it, right? That's a big thing, right? Does a guy like what we're doing? If he doesn't like it, again, he's probably going to do it, but he might not give his full effort. So if the guy believes in the value of what I'm prescribing, he's probably going to go after it. His adherence is going to be higher than if he doesn't believe in it. Excuse me. So again, I don't prescribe conventional deadlifts from the floor very often. I do prescribe them from time to time, mostly as sort of a novel variation to roughly translate over to, or roughly, how do I say this, roughly parallel to a trap bar deadlift, right? So now within the tactical realm, both operators and enablers, service members in general, have to perform the ACFT, or the Army Combat Fitness Test, right? And part of that test is, I believe, a 3-rep max trap bar deadlift, right? And we'll get into the trap bar here in a minute. But I would rather, and again, this is my bias from a powerlifting perspective, I would rather see a guy pull a conventional deadlift. I think it's more challenging, and I think the translation, I think the stimulus is greater. Now, again, you can argue, right? Are we looking at things from a neurological and muscular or a technical perspective? But I think the transfer of training from a straight bar conventional deadlift to the maximal effort stimulus that we're looking for is greater than a trap bar, because there are less opportunities to sort of cheat the movement, right? And again, we'll talk about the trap bar deadlift here in a minute, and like how I believe that you can kind of cheat the system, so to speak. But if I had to choose between the straight bar and the trap bar, I would absolutely choose the straight bar. Now, again, that is my bias, and I'm very open and clear about that as a powerlifter. I'm not married to the conventional deadlift. I don't think it is the end-all, be-all of pulling something from the floor. And I am 100% okay with going to the trap bar if we need to. But if we are looking for maximal posterior chain development, stimulus, and recruitment, as well as teaching how to properly brace, execute, and maintain tension across the system, I find the conventional deadlift to be a much more effective and efficient means of teaching that than the trap bar deadlift. So, and again, there are a multitude. Sorry, it is almost 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm sleeping better than I used to. Shout out to my girlfriend for that. But my brain is still not 100% firing right now. There are opportunities for more variations or more variables to be included with the conventional deadlift than with the trap bar deadlift, right? You can do bands, chains, mats, all that kind of stuff. Now, it's not to say, I guess, that you can't do that. Just like I said before, you can do all that with the trap bar. It's just less convenient, I think. And it becomes, let's say you do a trap bar high handle deadlift from like 2 or 3 inches of mats, right? That turns into a very short range of motion, very limited range of motion, or partial range of motion pull, which allows for a massive overload, which you can then argue, like, again, is that a safer alternative? Is that what you're really chasing? Are you chasing the maximal effort stimulus? Like, what are you trying to get after, right? So anyway, I'm getting tangential. But I think it's one of those things with the conventional deadlift that if you don't train it, you are setting yourself up for failure at some point, right? Because if we look at things, I'm not a huge like sports specificity fan. I think there absolutely is specificity, like a transfer of training from training movement to technical movement or to sports specific movement or tactical movement, right? So if we're talking about picking something up off the floor, right, or picking somebody up off the floor, right? You may not have time to get set up in a sumo stance, wedge in, bend down, grab it, and stand up with it. You may have to just bend down, grab it, and rip it, right? And that's not to say that's how I'm trying to teach my guys how to conventional deadlift. However, it's just like going overhead, right? So many of us as strength coaches are afraid to take our athletes, especially like baseball players or softball players who are overhead athletes. We're afraid of taking them overhead because of the fear of what might happen, right? The risk to reward ratio, all that kind of stuff, right? Injury mitigation, prevention, blah, 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 right? But if you never train in a particular range of motion or a particular plane of movement, right? What happens when you go there and you're not prepared for that? Whether from a neurological perspective, from a kinesthetic perspective, or straight from a muscular perspective. If you've never loaded your posterior chain from a hinge, with a conventional stance, and you're all of a sudden having to pick up something very heavy, like whether it's a teammate, ammo cans, jerry cans, whatever it is, if you're having to pick up something heavy and awkward from this conventional stance position, and you've never trained that position, what happens then? You might not get hurt, but you also might get severely injured, right? And when it comes, like I've talked about before, when it comes to the tactical world, if you get injured, you become a liability, right? Especially non-combat, non-contact. If it is a non-combat, soft tissue related injury, especially something that is related to training, you become then a liability, and your team suffers because of that, right? So my job as a strength and conditioning coach is to make sure that we mitigate, and I use that word a lot because I don't think prevention exists within the realm of injury. You can't prevent an injury, you can just mitigate the likelihood of it occurring. My job is to make sure that we are exposed to as many different stimuli as possible within the realm of reality and appropriateness, to ensure that when my operators are exposed to those stimuli on the field or in the field, they are prepared for them, or at least they are prepared for something relatively akin to it, right? Now again, if we're looking at sports specificity or tactical specificity, they're probably not going to need to pick up a barbell off the floor while they're in the field, right? But they may need to pick up a teammate. They may need to pick up a kit bag or gear bag or something like that, right? And again, if you're not prepared to move in that particular range of motion, or that particular plane of movement, what's going to happen when all of a sudden you have to underload under tempo, right? Under high tempo. So is the straight bar conventional deadlift my go-to with my tactical operators? Absolutely not. Is it an option? Yes. Is it something that should be included in your training cycle or in your training rotation? 100%. You just need to determine, for whether you're a strength coach or an operator, you need to determine what is most appropriate for you. Is it a rack pull? Is it a rack pull from the mid shin? Is it a rack pull from below the knee? Is it a rack pull from the knee or just above the knee? Right? Or is it pulling from the floor? Is it a deficit? Some guys are able to create more tension via a deficit because they have to wind in or wind up harder, or bunch up, I guess you could say. Like I think I'm a better deficit puller than I am from the floor, right? Because I get more leg drive, I have to squat, I have to go further down to get to the bar, I have to use more leg drive to stand up with it. My technique is actually, I think, a little bit better with my deficit pull. Not a massive deficit, we're not talking like 5 inches or 3 inches or something like that, right? We're talking like an inch or two, right? But I feel more comfortable and confident pulling from a deficit than I typically do from the floor, just because my positioning, the way that my leverages are, and the way that my body is sort of functioning right now allows me to create more tension through the deficit pull than through the conventional pull from the floor. Now, am I saying that you got to deficit pull your guys? Absolutely not, right? I think the deficit pull is a safe movement, but I also think it's an advanced movement. So you have to make sure that your guys or your operators or your population is prepared for that particular range of motion and for that stimulus, right? because even though you might be using less weight, I think it's a higher intensity stimulus by virtue of the extended or increased or lengthened range of motion or time under tension that your lifter is experiencing, right? So all that to say, find the thing that works best for you or your population and then go with it, right? Whether it's pulling from the floor, whether it's a rack pull from various heights, whether it's a block pull, and there's a difference between a block pull and a rack pull because of where the bar, like how the weight sits, right? How the weight is supported at the end of the barbell. Is it a deficit pull? Are you using bands, chains, reverse bands, all that kind of stuff, right? And we don't need to get into all the nuances of the different accommodating resistance options and profiles that we could look into. But yeah, so moving on to let's talk about the trap bar, right? So trap bar has a pretty well-established place within the tactical field. Again, the ACFT, part of the ACFT is a 3-rep max deadlift at various different echelons or intervals, depending on your age, your gender, all that kind of stuff, right? So trap bar deadlift. It's often, in my opinion, seen as a safer alternative to a conventional or even a sumo deadlift, but I don't think that's the case. I think it's an opportunity for people to cheat the movement and to assign tension in places or in positions that they might not otherwise. So if we look at a conventional deadlift, it's, I don't know what the angles are, right? What the degrees of angles are, right? But it's a hinge pattern. Knees are slightly out over the bar, or slightly not over toes, but toward the toes. Hips are high a little bit, so there's tension through the posterior chain, through the quads, through the spinal erectors, all that kind of stuff, so that you can vertically push, right? It's not a pull, it is a push. Well, it's a push-pull, but it's an extension. It's a hip and knee extension, right? To get to vertical posture, to get stacked up. The trap bar deadlift, by virtue of how the bar is designed and being inside the bar as compared to being behind the bar, allows a lifter to shift more into his or her anterior chain, so the knees, the quads, and get dorsiflexion through the ankles, right, as compared to a standard conventional deadlift, right, which may be great for some people, right? Maybe some people, again, have that lower back issue that precludes recruitment of the spinal erectors, the low back, in that conventional pull, but because the opportunity to shift forward into the knees and make it very quaddy, as a colleague of mine once said, allows for opportunity to more safely execute or more comfortably execute what is roughly a conventional pull. So I think that when it comes to the trap bar deadlift, you need to include it, even if it's once every 6 or 9 weeks or something like that, because everybody has to take the ACFT. Now, I think they have to take one per year or one every 6 months or something like that for record. So if nothing else, just for familiarity of the movement and of the tension you need to assign for that particular range of motion and that particular movement pattern, right? So you can conventional, you can sumo, you can rack pull, you can do all the different things, throw all the conjugate variations out that you want. But I think it's important if we're looking at things from a military perspective. Now, if we're looking at things from like a first responder, fire, police, EMT, whatever, who might not have to execute a trap bar deadlift as part of their physical testing battery, maybe don't include it, right? But again, if we're looking at things from the military perspective, where they have to, at least the Army perspective, where they have to execute this 3-rep max deadlift, you need to be familiar with the movement, at least familiar enough with the movement to execute it safely, effectively, and efficiently, so that you can maximize your score. Now, with the trap bar deadlift, you can do basically, like I said before, everything you can do with a conventional deadlift. You can do rack pulls, which I've done with guys. You can do reverse band, banded, chains, block pulls. You can do all the different stuff, right? It just turns into, because of the nature of the barbell, especially if you have a high or a low handle setup or high-low combo setup, the high handle is very much a cheat, right? It's a partial range of motion. It allows for a super maximal overload when it comes to the weight move, because the range of motion is so much shorter, right? So if we're looking at things, as I'm saying this, if we look at things from a neuromuscular, neurological perspective, like just CNS activation and recruitment, a heavy high handle trap bar deadlift might not be a bad opportunity to actually engage in true maximal exertion, right? from a generalized perspective, from a non-powerlifting bias perspective, right? Because if you can only pull 405 on the straight bar, but you can pull 495 on the trap bar by virtue of the handles, who cares about your range of motion, right? Your body, from a general performance perspective or from a general physiological adaptive perspective, doesn't know, like, hey, I only pulled it from this far. I only pulled it from, 8 inches as compared to 6 inches or whatever, right? It just knows stimulus and intensity and time under tension, right? Now, you can argue, of course, that like partial range of motion equals less time under tension, but then does that balance out? And I don't know the answer to this. Does that balance out, or does that equate? Does a higher relative intensity by virtue of the overload of weight balance out with the partial or shorter range of motion, and therefore a decreased time under tension, right? So does 1 + 1 = 2 or whatever, right? I don't know the answer to that. My bro science brain would say yes, that if you are lifting more weight, even across a shorter range of motion, your stimulus is going to be higher, again, from a non-powerlifting general perspective. But again, I don't know the answer to that. So, again, so people, coaches often argue that the trap bar is more accessible and a safer alternative to a conventional deadlift. And I agree with that to a point, right? I think it's easily accessible because people understand, like, hey, here are my handles. I don't have to worry about where my hands go. I don't have to worry about like how far forward the bar is relative to my body. They just step inside the bar, squat down, grab the bar, and they stand up with it, right? That's the most simplified, simplistic version of executing a trap bar deadlift. There's obviously more nuances to it than that. But I don't know if it's a safer alternative because you can overload it, right? And because you can shift more anteriorly, shift into a more anterior chain dominant position, it allows opportunities to shift away from appropriate posture as you would use like in a conventional deadlift, right? So if you're conventional deadlifting, the bar gets away from you forward, you're going to lose it, or you're going to round over so fucking hard that your shit's going to get completely out of whack, right? Sorry if you hear music in the background. I'm at my facility. Somebody just walked in, playing music on the other side, so hopefully my mic picks up just me and not too much background noise. So again, trap bar deadlift, just like the conventional deadlift, has its place. It just depends on how, when, why, and for what purpose, which I guess is why, you are choosing to implement it. Is it just for familiarity with the movement itself? Is it for a CNS overload? Is it for accessibility? What is it, right? So again, you gotta make your decision. Now, let's wrap up with sumo deadlift. Now, sumo deadlift, in my opinion, is among the three the safest and most appropriate or applicable variation of the deadlift for the tactical population. And I got this idea from Matt Wenning, who talked about, like, if you're going to pick somebody up, right? If you're going to pick up a teammate, if you're going to pick up a kit bag, unless you're running full speed or doing some kind of ranger roll, some kind of like grab and go type shit, you're probably going to set yourself up in a position where you're a little bit wider stance. Your center of gravity, your center of mass is over top of the center of mass of the object that you're trying to pick up, and you're going to go vertical with it, right? Because you don't want to see that hip extension, or that knee extension rather, with hip flexion into a massive hip extension afterwards, because that's going to overload your lower back and potentially create injury, right? And people talk about the sumo deadlift being a very technical movement, and I agree with that. But there is a high degree of technical requirement with the sumo deadlift, but that it's not as inaccessible or as gate-kept as some people might make it seem, right? It's really pretty simple. Take a wide stance, trim your toes out, get your shins close to the bar, a little bit of forward knee travel so the shins are out over the bar just a hair, wedge in so you create tension through the hamstrings to the posterior chain, and then push out to go vertical. Lateral force to vertical displacement. That's pretty simple at the end of the day, right? Now the nuances of that execution are a little bit more subtle, right? But that's where you get into the refinement of coaching, right? Are you looking at somebody who does a knee extension prior to a hip extension? Are you doing a hip extension prior to a knee extension? So that's where coaching comes in, right? again, if we go back to the conventional deadlift, talking about the injuries incurred by the majority of this population, lower backs, knees, hips, all that kind of stuff, we can utilize the sumo deadlift for the same reason that we utilize the wide stance, posterior chain heavy box squat, right? We stay out of the knees, we stay out of the lower back for the most part. We engage the quads, the hamstrings, the adductors, the abductors, the glutes, the hip flexors, all those things, right, with potentially minimal aggravation of the lower back. That's not to say that you won't experience aggravation or that you won't incur some kind of soft tissue related training injury, right, or some kind of flare up, right, because shit does happen even with our best of intentions to avoid it or mitigate it, right? But I have found from both, well, basically just from a professional perspective, that the sumo deadlift is often a friendlier, more accessible, and more comfortable, after some time, position to be in than a conventional deadlift, right? You can spend a lot of time in the sumo deadlift position, getting yourself squared away, wiggling back and forth, finding your particular width, your knee angle, your shin angle, all that kind of stuff, right? You can spend a lot of time in this conventional deadlift position, but it's much more taxing, right? It is a vulnerable, compromised position to be in. And I've always tried to keep my lifters out of that position for extended periods of time, right? So again, we can stay in that sumo stance for quite some time as we're getting ready until we bend over and start wedging in and creating all that tension and doing all that kind of stuff, right? The whole setup. But the initial approach to the bar is much friendlier, more accessible, and accommodating, in my opinion, than the conventional, even the trap bar deadlift is. And just like with conventional and trap bar, you can do a whole host of variations. You can go reverse band, versus bands, versus chains, rack pull, mat pull. You can do basically every deadlift variation with the exception of sumo inside the trap bar because of virtue of how the bar is built, obviously. You can do the same variation. So again, this comes down to what am I trying to achieve? What is my goal, right? What is the stimulus I'm after? So it's kind of the same things. What is my population comfortable with? What do they know how to do? And what is best for them in that moment, right? And there's going to be a whole host of other variables that you got to take into considerations to evaluate, right? But those are like the top 5 off the top of my head. So again, what's the best option for you? I can't say that, right? Are you a very strong conventional puller, but you're a weak sumo puller, and you never touch the trap bar? Is it some variation, the combination of those three variables, right? Are you strong in the trap bar, good in sumo, terrible at conventional, right? I don't know, right? But again, I have found that if we do not train, if we stay away from particular planes of movement or movement patterns, just because we're scared to go there, unless we have a very specific and valid reason to avoid that. If I have a guy who's got a fused spine, I'm probably not going to try to put him into a conventional deadlift position, right? We're going to go trap bar, or we're going to go like a sumo bar or a sumo deadlift rack pull or something like that, right? That allows for this, extension of the spine to stay out of flexion, which he's probably not going to do anyway, because if he's fused, depending on where he's fused, right? So it comes down to what are you trying to achieve? What are you capable of doing? And how much time do you have to teach the movement, right? Conventional is pretty easy. Bend down, pick the motherfucker up, right? Now again, subtleties and nuances of it are a little more refined than that. But at the end of the day, that's really all it is, right? Sumo, slightly more technical, but again, easily accessible, easily teachable, and easily refined. Trap bar, very easy. Here are my handles. I'm going to squat down. I'm going to grab it. The only thing that I have found with the trap bar is that people are either too far forward with the bar or too far backward, right? So their center of gravity is not aligned with the center of gravity or the midline of that bar, right? So when they go to make their pull or make their push, their initial movement off the floor, they are either too far forward and they go this way, or they are too far backward and they round over, right? So again, subtle nuances that have to be refined over time. But again, it comes down to what are you trying to execute? What are your goals? What is your population capable of? And what are they comfortable with? What are you comfortable with as a coach? If you're not comfortable coaching sumo deadlift, one, get comfortable with it. Learn how to coach something you don't know how to coach, right? Broaden your horizons, broaden your palette, so to speak. So learn how to do things you don't know how to do. Take time for yourself to learn how to do it, so you can teach other people how to do it. But if you don't know how to do something, don't fake it, right? That's one thing I've learned very keenly in this population is that they will sniff out your bullshit. And if you don't know how to do something, they're gonna know, right? So if you don't know how to coach a sumo deadlift, stick with conventional or trap bar until you know how to coach a sumo deadlift. And vice versa across those three variations, right? So that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. Please like, comment, subscribe. You can follow me on Instagram. My personal is @Jimberjacked, or my business is @Hammer Strength and Ammonia. And as always, do not waste the pain.